We have been having a national conversation about policing and what policing should look like going forward. But in my mind, the goal of that conversation should be figuring out how to capture the benefits of policing that we know exist in terms of crime reduction, with fewer of the costs that come from over policing and all of the other stuff.
What could go right? I'm Zachary Karabell, the founder of the Progress Network, and I'm joined, as always, by Emma Varvaloucas, the executive director of the Progress Network. And we are on season 3 of What Could Go Right, our podcast that looks at the world from a different lens than much of the mainstream media looks at the world. A lens of what's the more positive aspects of our societies, how are we constructively solving our problems, and speaking with individuals who are focused on those questions with that angle and not, which is more typically the case, all the things that are going wrong. And again, these conversations are predicated on the humility of none of us really know what the future is going to bring, and the certainty that it's all going downhill seems to be a certain arrogance about what we think we know about the future. I don't know that the future is going to be better. Emma doesn't know that the future is going to be brighter, and the Progress Network doesn't guarantee that everything is going to go well or that it's going to go right. But we need to pay more attention to the possibility and to the work that's being done by many and manifold individuals to make that possibility a reality. And underlying all of that is a sense that we are much more likely to create the future that we want to live in rather than the future we fear we are going to live in by believing in our collective possibility to create it than we are by focusing relentlessly, constantly, continually on all the things that we know are going wrong. So with that in mind, one of the things that we are concerned about, we collectively in the United States, and certainly to some degree around the world, is the spike in crime over the past few years, particularly as the world shut down during the pandemic and as it messily opened up in 2021. Into 2022, there has been a notable spike in violent crime in most major urban areas, and it's not entirely clear why that's happening, and it's certainly not clear or agreed upon about what to do with it. And so we're going to speak to someone today who is an expert in studying these trends from a more dispassionate, pragmatic angle and has been looking at ways to address crime pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, during pandemic, you name it. So we're going to speak with Jennifer Doleac, and Emma's going to introduce her. And then afterwards, we'll look, as we have been doing in this season, on some of the news of the day that's more unheralded. News that probably hasn't gotten the attention that it should or the attention that it could. We're going to talk a bit about Iran, Italy, and cancer. Two of those things don't seem very optimistic, but we're going to look at them from a more constructive angle. But first, we're going to talk to Professor Jennifer Doleac, and Emma's going to tell us who she is. Sometimes I feel like, tell us who she is, Emma. It's like we're about to be on a game show, tell us about our contestants. But in this case, it's to tell us about the fascinating, complicated, and unique individuals that we're going to be speaking with.
Or maybe it's a surprise game show this episode. But,
maybe it is.
Happy...
Door number 1.
Happy to tell you about Jennifer Doleac, who is an economist. She's an associate professor at Texas A&M Department of Economics, where she studies the economics of crime and discrimination. She's also the director of the Justice Tech Lab, a non-resident fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, a research affiliate at the University of Chicago Crime Lab, and a research fellow at IZA.
So let's talk with Jennifer. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us today. So as we approach midterm elections in the United States, certainly in any urban area, one thing that's hugely on voter minds, in addition to inflation, is safety in cities and crime. And this has been kind of a rolling, intensifying debate between people in various states, between people in various cities about what's going on with cities post-pandemic, whether we're post-pandemic or not. I don't really want to get into the partisan issues around that, but certainly as we're in a very different phase of whatever it was we were in, and post-Black Lives Matter intensity in the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, issues of policing and crime in cities have been really ever more intensifying, and in Congress as well. Mm-hmm. So this is an area you've thought a lot about. So the political dimension is clear, right? Meaning there's a huge political debate about policing, about crime, about all these things. And I think a lot of your work is much more pragmatic, and some of it's theoretical, some of it's pragmatic, some of it's applied. So when people ask you about these issues and want to know some sort of insight politically, how do you enter in those conversations?
Yes, I do. I do try to be very pragmatic in these conversations. Um, Ultimately, most of my work is on, what works to actually make communities safer. And I have a lot to say about that. But in this political conversation, I think what's been interesting to me is, violent crime, particularly homicide, is increasing in a lot of cities. That's scaring a lot of people. And that is also in a context where we have been benefiting for a few decades now from falling violent crime rates that we don't fully understand, right? So violent crime spiked in the late 80s, early 90s, and then it just started declining, and we still don't know why. And I think that now that we see violent crime starting to increase, that uncertainty, that unknown is freaking people out, right? It's like, maybe, we don't really understand why we've been so safe for all these years. And so that means it could turn around at any moment. And maybe we're at the beginning of another huge increase in violent crime. And so I think that's sort of in the background of all these conversations. And what I try to remind people of, and what I hope that this policy conversation goes, is that we've learned a lot over the last couple of decades about how to do this better this time. In the 90s, basically, we decided to just lock everybody up, be really tough on crime. We've learned a lot since then that can be quite counterproductive. Certainly not the best use of our public safety dollars. And so as we think about how to handle violent crime now, and as people are understandably worried about their own safety and the safety of their kids and their communities, I hope that everyone will sort of keep their heads on straight, at least most of the time, so that we can be thoughtful about the policies that we're implementing and keep going in a positive direction rather than reverting based on fear.
What we're seeing is a very specific, dramatic increase in murder and gun violence. There was about a 30% increase nationally in murder from 2019 to 2020. Year on year, it was by far the largest increase ever recorded. We have data going back to the 1960s in terms of national murder trends. The largest previous increase was 12.5% year on year. So a 30% increase was really dramatic.
It's funny. So I grew up in New York in the 1970s, or I was a kid in the 70s, and that was sort of the beginning of, maybe it wasn't the beginning, it was certainly a period where papers like the New York Post just reveled in kind of crime porn as a constant thing. And there's a lot of echo of that today, where you'll sort of have someone highlight something without a lot of sensibility of kind of what you just said, which is we're sort of a 30-year period of declining crime rates in almost every major American city and European cities as well. Same is true for London and Paris. Chicago may be an exception. There are places that didn't see that as much. Detroit. I guess one pushback to what you're saying is it's true that we really don't know what led to that decrease. I mean, everybody wanted to point to a good mayor, but it was true in every city, so it couldn't have been that particular to the individual city. But it does seem to me that all this spike is after things had shut down in one form or another in almost every city in the United States and Europe, and then sort of opened up in a chaotic, incoherent, messy fashion. And in most cities, there's a lot of homelessness. A lot of that homelessness is there's also mental health issues. It seems to me like the explanation now for the spike up is less perplexing than the decline starting in the mid to late 80s. I mean, what would you say about that?
Maybe. I mean, that had been my hunch initially when, we saw violent crime, we saw homicide and shootings specifically increase when the COVID shutdowns began. And so at that time, I remember telling lots of people who were asking about this then, my hunch is this is about the shutdown. There are fewer people out on the streets, fewer potential witnesses, fewer potential bystanders. And so, if you are engaged in gang violence or drug-related violence or something like that, it's kind of a free-for-all in these empty streets now. And so we would expect then for all of that to go down once things started opening back up again and people are out again. And so, maybe there's a haphazardness to that, but for the most part, things are back to normal in most cities, and homicide is not dropping back to pre-pandemic levels. And so it seems to me at this point that we've kind of, the best explanation I've heard is, there are more guns out and available and on the streets now. And we've and things have just sort of spiraled, right? So if more people are carrying guns, homicides up, then more people carry guns for their self-defense, and then you get even more violence. And so it's getting back to that pre-pandemic equilibrium is going to be harder. But that's all, frankly, speculation, and we don't really fully understand it yet. But I think the fact that things, went up, but then didn't go right back down as soon as people started moving around again suggests that it wasn't, even if this was spurred by the pandemic shutdowns, it's not going to be as easy as just going back to normal and returning to those pre-pandemic levels.
So as someone who was born into this era of low crime, it's all I've ever known, thankfully. I actually was coming to your research, Jennifer, assuming that we did know why crime was going down, and that any attempts to, continue that trend were issues of policy or implementation or something like that. And I didn't realize that actually we don't know why. And I love that you started out this whole thing, this whole conversation with, you look at what works. So I'm dying to know, what does work when it comes to reducing crime. I also want to ask you about a couple other topics, but we can stay on crime for now.
Sure. Yeah, it turns out that figuring out if specific programs or policy interventions are effective is a much easier question to answer than why did this big drop in crime happen over the couple decades, which might seem strange to people, but it's just easier to answer these more specific questions. So if we're talking about violent crime, so crime can mean different things to different people. If we're talking about violent crime specifically, the first thing that is clearest that comes out of all the research evidence is that putting more police on the streets reduces homicide. So increasing police presence does have a deterrent effect on violent crime, specifically homicide. We have been having a national conversation about policing and what policing should look like going forward. But in my mind, the goal of that conversation should be figuring out how to capture the benefits of policing that we know exist in terms of crime reduction, with fewer of the costs that come from over-policing and all of the other stuff. So that's kind of the policy and research conversation now, is how to reform policing in a way that maximizes the benefits, minimizes the costs. Aside from policing, we know that increasing the probability of getting caught for crime is much more effective than increasing the punishment for crime. So putting cameras everywhere, increasing or adding more people to law enforcement DNA databases, which I've studied, those are much more effective policies than increasing prison sentences, putting someone in prison for 10 years, if we wanted to deter crime on the front end. In terms of non-criminal justice interventions, there's a whole bunch of stuff that people have studied. So summer jobs for teens. There have been really nice randomized controlled trials now in a number of cities, like the gold standard of evidence there, and that reduces violent crime arrests and even mortality due to homicide. We know that air pollution increases criminal behavior and violent crime in particular. And so if you compare neighborhoods that are on one side of a highway versus the other side, if the wind is blowing in this direction, violent crime over here goes up. If the wind is blowing over here, violent crime over here goes up, which is terrifying. And so, putting things like air filters in classrooms like that, that could be effective. Let's see. There's also more and more evidence every day that increasing access to mental health care is really important for reducing violent crime. And I could talk at length about that. But there's lots of evidence that just that has big preventive effects, as well as preventing, your first interaction with the criminal justice system, as well as helping you kind of get on a better path after you've cycled through the system a couple of times. So there's a whole bunch of stuff out there, an endless array of options for policymakers to choose from, which is a pretty cool place to be.
So how do you balance fact and fear? A lot of people fear and feel anxious and scared about rising crime, particularly in urban areas.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked a lot on the podcast, and I certainly we talk a bit on the whole what could go right and the Progress Network of you can't quote statistics as a way of trying to offset people's feelings. In fact, that's a profoundly counterproductive reality. But trying to have all of us become more aware about the context in which we live is also vital. And most homicide levels in most American cities are back to around where they were in 2014. So it's gotten worse, but from kind of Emma's point, from a very, very low base, right? So someone could say crime is up 100%, but if it goes from 5 to 10, that's 100%.
Right.
But that's a radically different reality than if it goes from 500 to 1,000. And I guess I wonder how you deal with this, right? You're in an inherently quantitative profession that has inherently qualitative applications, right? And another thing that gets lost in all of this is not only is there not a national reality, there's hardly even a reality within cities in a micro way, right? So a lot of crime, again, New York or Chicago, particularly murders, is confined to very, very, very particular and very small areas within each of those cities. It's not like it's dispersed evenly. In fact, it's skewed immensely. Someone was saying something in New York where something like 80% of all murders occur in 5% of whatever the police department actually divides the city into quadrants. A lot of police departments do this. So how do you deal with the fact fear problem?
I don't think I have a great answer for that. Like it's, I mean, part of my, honestly, like as you're talking about this is like, well, I'm really lucky that's not my job. My job is to do the research and summarize for people what the research says. Luckily, one thing I really like about working in criminal justice issues is that there's, at least for a while now, has been a really broad political consensus that the current system is not working very well. And we would all like a more fair and effective criminal justice system. And people come to that table for different reasons, but everyone winds up at the same table, right? So left, right, religious right, libertarian, like everyone is dissatisfied with the status quo. And so that means that people in general in this space have been much more open to what the research evidence says about how to reduce crime than I think in a lot of policy spaces. I think that's still true. Like I still get lots of calls from policy folks asking, what do we know about what reduces violent crime? And so that suggests that they're interested in doing more than just signaling to their local community that they care, right? I mean, the easy thing to do would be to just arrest everybody, throw them in prison for a really long time. That's sort of, and I think it probably helps that that's really expensive. And so not a great default from the policy side. If you want to signal that you're trying, there are big downsides to going down that road again. So, I mean, this is, I think, certainly a question that elected representatives are really dealing with. I just try to say over and over again, we know that increasing prison sentences does not reduce crime. We know that, doing these other things does. If you're serious about actually having an impact on crime, do these other things. But related to your question, which is something else I think a lot about, is sort of the role of discretion among these various decision makers and courts and police officers and all the rest. So a lot of it seems like a big reason that we wind up over incarcerating or over detaining people pre-trial and other things like that is that the individual judge who has to make that decision is punished severely if they decide to let somebody out who then happens to go on to commit another crime. But if they lock too many people up, if they err too much on the side of harshness, nobody notices, right? You're locking too many people up, and so you don't notice that those people would not have actually committed more crime if you let them out. And so whenever there's an individual decision maker who's using their discretion in that way, it's going to push us in a direction toward more punitiveness than is necessary. And so there's been I think more and more places are experimenting with using algorithms or some sort of like standardized rules that say, anyone who is rated low risk is automatic release pretrial or something like that, rather than having them go before a judge and having the judge decide. And so whenever you have a blanket policy like that, that reduces the discretion from the decision makers, that can help us push in a direction where we sort of know collectively that's the right thing to do for public safety. But if we're going to put it on an individual judge, they're always going to take the safe route and just lock that person up just in case. So I think that's one way in which this, like, we can push against and counter this, the way that fear affects what we're doing on the ground.
Just to emphasize that, one of the only bipartisan pieces of legislation that came out of the Trump years was the First Step Act at the end of 2018, which reduced prison sentences and kind of was a move in the direction you're talking about. And I think had funding from both, the Koch network and Soros, who would normally be seen as not working hand in hand, but this kind of consensus of the system not working, and a bill that was, I think, in many ways very constructive.
Thousands of former prisoners who thought they would spend Christmas behind bars are free thanks to the help of the First Step Act. President Trump signed the legislation into law last December. The act increases the number of good conduct time credits an inmate can earn per year. It also built on the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, signed by former President Obama, which reduced penalties for crack cocaine offenses. The U.S. Sentencing Commission says those changes can help more than 140,000 people in prison.
In general, I'm pretty pessimistic about the role the federal government plays in especially criminal justice policy. I mostly just want them to stay out of it because there's so much action happening at the local and state levels. And so you get, liberal states, conservative states have all made huge changes in criminal justice policy, really trying to, reduce incarceration rates, improve rehabilitation, all these other things on the ground where it actually is affecting communities. And, governors need to balance their budgets. And again, prison's really expensive, so that helps. But even in that context, we saw the federal government do something where you had a broad consensus.
Speaking of the federal government doing things and not doing things and, consensus and not having consensus, the mega table that we mostly can't seem to get around is about shootings, right, in the U.S. And I know that you researched that as well. And what struck me when you were describing some of the things that worked around policing is that some of them were immediately like, ooh, we're in, political waters here. But some of them, like, no one's going to get mad probably about summer jobs programs for teens. Like, I can't really imagine a lobby against that. So I'm curious if there's any kind of low-hanging fruit like that around shootings that might kind of help people think about that there might be another way through our gun issues in the U.S.
Yeah. So, I think the mental health access issue or topic is relevant there. I think, shootings are going to be the interventions that affect shootings are going to be similar to the interventions that affect homicide or other kinds of violent crime. So we actually have much less research on like shooting specifically because it's really hard to measure gunfire. You have to, for the most part, count on people calling 911, which they don't necessarily do. But if the bullet hits someone, then it will definitely get counted. And those things are obviously correlated. So in general, I'd put shootings sort of in the same bucket as just other gun violence in general and homicide in general. And so there, mental health care is really effective. Again, you're right that, putting more police on the streets can be more controversial, but it's also something that I think when we're kind of there are a lot of interventions that one could put in place with police departments that perhaps are going to be less hot button issues, like increasing, investigative resources or something like that. But yeah, I think overall it's going to be a lot of the same stuff I mentioned before. Yeah. I think, as soon as guns come up, people sort of go to the default of, we have to implement stricter gun laws and we have to reduce, the ability of people to carry guns around. And the reality is, we've been talking about that for decades and we're not making a lot of progress on that issue. And so, keeping in mind that if our goal is to reduce gun violence and our goal is to, save lives, there are other ways to save lives that sort of ignore, for the most part, the gun piece of it and just treat it like violence, like any other sort of violence. So cognitive behavioral therapy, mental health care, those kinds of things would probably be at the top of my list.
I would say it's good to have the reminder that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. when it comes to regulations and interventions like the ones that you mentioned.
Right. I think a lot of times the gun conversation in particular, I feel like people get very quickly distracted by what their ideal policy would be and seeing that policy as the goal rather than keeping their eye on the ball of like, presumably we all have the same goal of saving lives, and people have different ideas about how to achieve that goal.
It sounds like you feel like even with the sort of mid to late 2020 to present increase, that overall there's been a lot that's been really constructive and creative at the local and state level over the past, I don't know, X number of years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Is that correct? I mean, you sound like you feel that there's been a lot of positive developments in this world. And I would like to know if there's some indication on the mental health side, because my impression has been that's really lagging as part of these like lattice of, there's been bail reform, there's been programs, there's been sort of, community policing, not focused on arresting, but focused on, maintaining a presence. So is that a correct, you feel pretty positive about the local trajectory of these things?
Yeah, definitely. I'm definitely an optimist, not only in terms of seeing action on the ground and moving in the right direction, but also that we have answers at this point, and are going to continue to accumulate more answers. And so, I mean, I think, just over the last couple of decades, I mean, I'm a researcher, right? And I spend a lot of time looking at data and trying to find natural experiments that can help us understand that, like, split people and places into treatment and comparison groups that help us understand what the effect of some program was. And over the past couple of decades, there's just been huge progress just on data infrastructure and, the availability of data from organizations like police departments or like prosecutors' offices that are giving us a chance to actually dig in there and figure out if what those people are doing is working. And, that's just crucial. We just had no idea before, right? We're just kind of going based on hunches. And then alongside that, there's been slow but steady, what I would call culture change in the criminal justice policy space, where people really are focused more on testing whether what they're doing is working and iterating on their approaches. So operating on hunches isn't acceptable anymore. And that's partly because there are more and more people doing the kind of work I'm doing, writing these research papers and demonstrating that certain kinds of policies and interventions work, partly because more and more funders are requiring that kind of evidence when they give a grant to a place. But in general, I think that's been really huge here. There are a lot of ways in which the criminal justice policy space is like 10 years behind the education policy space. So in terms of data, in terms of thinking about different types of reforms, accountability, all those kinds of things. So we're behind, but we're moving, and it's going pretty quickly at this point. And yeah, I mean, there are some downsides to our criminal justice system in the U.S. being extremely disaggregated. I think depending on how you count, there are between 12,000 and 18,000 police departments across the U.S. That makes it difficult to implement a blanket policy change if we know what we should be doing. But in the current moment, we don't really know what we should be doing. And so it's actually really awesome to have 12 to 18,000 places all trying different stuff, right? And then that gives us lots of, it's like the laboratory of democracy kind of idea, lots of different little mini experiments that help us figure out what works and what we should be iterating on. And so, yeah. It's just, I think there's just it feels like a golden age of certainly criminal justice research. But then people actually listen to us, which is even better.
I love that line of it's the golden age of criminal justice research. And on the one hand, it's super fun to see someone be so excited about data, because I also get really excited about data as a journalist, and I try to tell other people how exciting data is. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it's a little nerve-wracking to think about how long, like you're saying, we're going along with hunches, but I won't. I won't land there for too long.
Focus on the progress.
Yes. I actually wanted to ask you a personal question, which is how you got into this, because it might surprise people to know that you're an economist, and then the jump from that title to I do this kind of research might not be obvious to a lot of us, including me. So I would love to hear how you entered into this.
Yeah. Why am I here? How did I get into
How
this
are you
space?
here?
Who am I?
Yeah. So I'm an economist by training. And basically what economists bring to the table is one, a really strong empirical toolkit. We are more focused, I think it's fair to say, than any other type of social science researcher on distinguishing correlation from causation. So we look for actual experiments, RCT, randomized controlled trials, or natural experiments where you have a policy change that very cleanly divides people into treatment and comparison groups. And that gives us something akin to the lab experiment we'd love to have, but we'll never actually have in the real world. And so as a PhD student, I was hunting around for these natural experiments, because that's what you do as an econ PhD student, and basically read a New York Times article about DNA database policy in the US and how every state has its own laws and own rules about which types of criminal offenders are required to provide DNA to the state DNA database. And the point of the article was like, isn't this crazy and totally arbitrary that like if you live in Kansas and you commit robbery, you go in the database, but if you live in Iowa and commit the same crime, you don't. And to someone like me, that's a beautiful natural experiment. And so we can compare the outcomes in these different states and look at database expansions and when they were implemented and compare people just before and after the expansion. And so that became my dissertation. And even at that point, it was still a pretty niche area within economics. I got my PhD in 2012. And so even at that point, I was like, I don't know, I'm interested in crime, but I'm also interested in other things. We'll see how this progresses. And then eventually I accepted that this is a super interesting policy area and we have a lot of work to do. And we need people with that toolkit focusing on these questions. And so now I'm all in. The other thing economists bring to the table that's a little different from other researchers is we're very focused on how people respond to incentives. And so we're very focused on sort of how people make decisions, but this incentive piece and finding ways in which like incentives are not aligned with our policy goals is something we get very excited about. And so and the criminal justice space is full of misaligned incentives. And so thinking through like how could we be aligning incentives better to get better outcomes is something that someone like me can be helpful with.
Well, that's a good pan to academic economics or economists in a way that I'm not sure makes me want to be one, but it certainly is persuasive. Plus, you've given us a little bit of practical knowledge for those listening. If you're considering committing a crime, it's clearly better to do so in Iowa than it is to do so
you might want to check current law, but so, yeah.
So not only are you a theoretical researcher, there's a serious pragmatic applications for that. Not always the ones that,
That's right.
Anyway, I want to thank you for joining us today. Obviously, these are, massive issues that are going to continue to percolate throughout society. Hopefully percolate in a less intensive way. We'll see if this spike is really a pandemic hangover or a new normal that we obviously don't want to be a new normal, but it's probably too soon to tell which of those two things it is. And it'll be interesting to hear what your conclusions are when we circle back to this in a few years. And I want to thank you for being part of the Progress Network and for all the work that you do.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thanks, Jennifer.
So that was another great conversation. I particularly like, by the way, that the expression laboratories of democracy came up. And that's the second episode in a row that Laboratories of Democracy has entered into the What Could Go Right podcast, because it came up as well when we talked to Senator Hertzberg. We did not go over bail reform. I'm sure Jennifer has her own angle on that and has done research. But it just points to the fact that the kind of the world of criminal justice reform and dealing with these issues is kind of a vast territory, covering everything from education and, as she mentioned, air quality, not just what tends to be focused on, which is guns and police, and that this is a kind of a social problem that has deep roots, and that if we're going to deal with any of this, we have to look at the complexity of it and the regional differences of it and learn from a lot of progress that's been made. It's great to hear someone talk about things are actually getting better, even if in the short term, they are admittedly and unquestionably getting worse.
And with all those factors at play and the use of, laboratories of democracy, I feel like talking to somebody like Jennifer, you think a little bit more like scientists solving cancer and less like mad scientists. Oh my God, what's going on in the US is crazy, which I feel like is the normal mindset when people talk about American politics and something as politically tense as crime.
And that you can bring data to bear on these questions. You know, it's not just, oh my God, it's all like, you don't have to rely on newspaper headlines and popular sentiment and immediate emotions, that there's actually people looking at this and studying it and thinking about it from a, you know, a dispassionate perspective, but a passionate one about solving problems. You know, dispassionate about the data and seeing where it leads, but passionate about doing something constructive with it. And I think, you know, Jennifer is absolutely exhibit A for that, but there are many others within this universe who are as well. So let's turn a bit to the unheralded, or the things that happened that most people weren't paying attention to.
Yeah, so I would like to talk about the Italian elections first. I'm not sure how many people were paying attention to that, but I feel like we should look at it on this podcast as a little bit of a corrective to some of the hysteria that I saw around Giorgia Meloni's election to be the future prime minister of Italy.
As we reported, Italians have chosen their first far-right-wing government since World War II. Giorgia Meloni is expected to become the first female prime minister to lead Europe's third-largest economy. Her party, Brothers of Italy, draws its roots from Italy's fascist history. Today, she sounded a moderate tone, but as Nick Schifrin reports, her recent rhetoric has many in Italy and wider Europe concerned.
And
Tell us how. Everybody's up in arms. Oh my God, Giorgia Meloni, you know, she emails with Steve Bannon. The right likes her. Is she just another version of Marine Le Pen and Viktor Orban? Aren't we going down that path? Explain, please, why that is not the case.
Right. That's exactly what I saw. That immediately after the results came in, there's a lot of like, Italy is backsliding into fascism.
Yeah, there was one headline about this. It said the most right-wing premier since Mussolini.
Right.
You know, that headline, it was, and this was, I don't know, it was in the New York Times, but it was like a major mainstream. I mean, that is hardly a subtle comparison.
Yep. And the first sentence in an Associated Press article was like, you know, Giorgia Meloni, whose party has fascist roots, comma, you know, and then on with the rest of the article. And those things are true. But the problem for me about the hysteria on fascism is that there's a lot of constraints of reality. And we talk about this on the podcast a lot, that don't point to the fact that Italy is backsliding towards fascism. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to support Giorgia Meloni as a future prime minister or her policies, which are to the right. You know, if you are care about sexual minorities or immigrants and are kind of progressive, you know, quote unquote, about that stuff, it's not like it's something that we're celebrating. But I do think that it's worth detailing a concern about that versus a concern about fascism. And I just don't see the signs there that Italy is going to become as it was during Mussolini's time. What do you think?
I mean, look, it is also true that she's the head of a coalition government. Italy's had 20 governments in 20 years. There's absolutely no indication that her coalition is going to be any more tenable or long-lived than any others. The only person who's really kind of had a multi-year grip on Italian politics in the past 30 or 40 years is Berlusconi. And while there was a lot of buffoonery about Berlusconi, you know, he was a problematic and in many ways, you know, democratically corrosive figure in a way that maybe he got a pass from to some degree, because a lot of people just don't care about politics and a lot of Italians shrugged it off. So I'm just trying to put that in I think her party get barely 25% of the vote, her particular party, not the whole coalition, which is she's going to be the head of. But if you're the head of a coalition government, unless that coalition were far to the right of her party, that's a massive constraint. And kind of conservative nationalism does not translate into fascism. I mean, we've got to be really careful. These headlines were sloppy. The assumptions of what it meant were sloppy. And, you know, Italian politics has been sloppy regardless. I do think it's just really important not to leap to these assumptions, particularly without any real analysis. And and a lot of that went on around Italy. Like, let's see.
And just to restate, this doesn't mean that you can't have a party whose views you support and then there are bad outcomes, with the policies that party ends up implementing, and vice versa. You can have a party that you're expecting a lot of bad things and there might be good outcomes. And we're not naive. We're not saying that we should forget our concerns, our issues, or problems, but there's room to be concerned or to not support people's positions without that meaning that they're fascist. And there's room for our fears about what may happen to turn out to be wrong. And that also reminds me of something that Congressman Eric Swalwell said on the first episode of the podcast, that when you repeat stuff like that, it down the road makes people less and less skilled to discern when you actually have a fascist threat at hand. And like I said, I think it also, there's a sort of a poor assumption about people buried in all of this, which is that we can't show concern for her particular policies that are real policies that she's outlined, that we have to kind of go the extra mile to be like, hey, ring the bells, care about this. But I think that people would care, anyway.
And to be a little bit in the weeds about Italian politics, I mean, it's Salvini and the Northern League. I mean, he's a much more alarming figure, and maybe we would be having a different conversation. Yes, he'll be part of this coalition unequivocally, but he's not going to become the prime minister. And I think that again, let's see how this plays out as an actual government, not as a group of people who ran on different programs in order to win an election. And look, I would have said the same thing I did say the same thing to people about Trump at the end of 2016, which is, don't be so quick to demonize. Now, maybe there were reasons subsequently to demonize, and a lot of people then would say, well, I told you so. But there are some reasons to wait to say I told you so rather than anticipating the worst and taking actions that in their own way can bring the worst about.
Agreed on that. So something that's like, pretty far down the road of authoritarian governments, Iran, and everything that's going on there with the hijab burning and the protests after Mahsa Amini was allegedly killed by the morality police while in custody because she had, hair visible under her hijab. Iran's going through an internet blackout now, but before that was in place, there were incredible images all over the news and all over social media of this resistance against the government. That's quite oppressive. And my little speech about hope in this one is that I'm seeing from various news coverage that it's the first time that they've seen women out there protesting about the hijab with men, and all of social media, right? Like the world is watching in a way that the world wasn't watching in 2009 or 1979. So.
Look, and I mean, this whole dynamic, which is unfamiliar in contemporary Iran, even with the democracy protests that have been violently put down over the past 10 years, you do have a government of aging male theocrats. That's the most neutral way to describe the clerical regime in Iran, which is a very small group of people who are exercising a large amount of control and are fully aware that their control at this point rests on some combination of nationalism, corruption, and very thin acceptance of the theocratic framework that brought on the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And if you have a lot of young women, and a lot of this is, under 30, saying no, that's much harder to deal with than angry young men. Older authoritarian men are much more comfortable. This may be sexist, but it's still true, are much more comfortable violently suppressing angry young men in the streets than they are used to doing so with angry young women. Now, I'm sure the regime is fully capable of equal acts of violence against a large number of women. But when that is then joined as a kind of societal thing, that's a real challenge. And we'll have to see how this plays out. But it was, I think, unexpected for the regime. I don't think they were looking out for this. They were looking out for, student cells plotting They weren't looking out for what usually brings down regimes like this, which is a sudden, massive eruption of pent up, I don't know, like enough.
I wasn't expecting that take at all, and I love it. That like all of a sudden there's these, 25-year-old women being like, absolutely not, I'm done. And it makes total sense because these are modern women that are connected to TikTok. I was on TikTok seeing these videos before the news coverage even started, and it was like millions of views, millions of likes, and that's the generation that they're dealing with. So the question everyone asks around these things is like, is this time going to be different? Like you said, we don't know. But I like this framing that you did of like, this is a serious threat to deal with.
And also, like, one of the ironies of the Iranian regime over the past 40 years, it's been really good at education. Now, some of that's indoctrination, but in terms of like literacy and education and, university attendance, and this may be one of these cases of, if you really want to be a long-lasting autocratic regime, you probably should study North Korea and try not to have so many people really well educated, or at least educated with an awareness of what's going on around the world. So, all right, fingers crossed. Fingers crossed for this one. But it's a good. Again, what we're trying to do is let's pay attention to things that are both unexpected and potentially positive. Not that we are in any way sure that they will be so. We could be revisiting this in a much sorrier fashion 4 weeks from now. But for the time being, it's real. It's part of what's going on in that society, and it bears paying attention to.
Yep. And two very quick ones before we go that may lift people's spirits. First of all, new numbers came out from those among us who count cancer survival rates and cancer deaths, and it's all good news. We have far more cancer survivors these days than we used to. Far fewer people are dying from cancer. That's thanks to treatments, but also early screenings for cancer. So congratulations to everyone for being alive at a time that you have less of a chance of dying from cancer.
And the treatments, I mean, look, immunotherapies, which even 10 years ago were seen as sort of pie in the sky, have proven to be remarkably effective. Now, it's a certain type of cancer, it's certain numbers, and it's still not yet a huge number of people because these are unbelievably costly treatments, but they are unbelievably effective. I mean, there are people who are living, what is essentially cancer-free lives because of immunotherapies, who would have perished 10 years ago.
New stuff is coming out all the time. Last but not least, we can't end without mentioning that after our conversation with Senator Hertzberg last week, and California being the state to copy, indeed, New York became the first state to copy the 2035 new combustion engine vehicle ban. So there you go.
It's catching on, although I want to see those charging stations in New York City before we see the mandate. I'm a little more confident in California's ability to get that done than New York's, but it's good to set markers, good to set benchmarks.
More space in California, but we'll see.
All right, so that's our eclectic roundup of things that could have a more positive outcome between not so fast on the Italian elections, look at what's going on in Iran, thank God for cancer survival rates going up, and maybe we're going to have electric cars in New York. We'll revisit all of this in the weeks to come and have yet another conversation with yet another compelling individual and some unexpected news of the week next week. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, Zachary.